Hello everyone! Welcome to Literature Revision with Mr. Johnson. Today, we're going to be studying our second extract from Chapter 1. In this extract, Stevenson introduces us to the theme of duality. Now before we begin, you may be interested in downloading my free resource for this extract. Click a link in the description box below this video to download this resource for free. It comes complete with writing tables for taking notes, short writing tasks, and exemplar paragraphs. Let's now summarise our extract. Every Sunday, Utterson goes for a walk with his friend and cousin Richard Enfield. One Sunday, they are walking down a pleasant-looking street. Utterson and Enfield then see a sinister-looking building. This decaying building looks neglected. Later in the novel, it is revealed that this building is Jekyll's laboratory, the place where Hyde was first created. Let's now read our extract. It chanced on one of these rambles that the way led them down a by-street in a busy quarter of London. The street was small, and what is called quiet, but it drove a thriving trade on the weekdays. The inhabitants were all doing well, it seemed, and all aimlessly hoping to do better still, and laying out the surplus of their gains in coquetry, so that the shop fronts stood along that thoroughfare with an air of invitation, like rows of smiling saleswomen. Even on Sunday, when it veiled its more florid charms and lay comparatively empty of passage, the street shone out in contrast to its dingy neighbourhood, like a fire in a forest, and with its freshly painted shutters, well-polished brasses, and general cleanliness and gaiety of note, instantly caught and pleased the eye of the passenger. Two doors from one corner on the left hand going east, the line was broken by the entry of a court, and, just at that point, a certain sinister block of building thrust forward its gable on the street. It was 2 stories high, showed no window, nothing but a door on the lower story and the blind forehead of discoloured wall on the upper, and bore, in every feature, the marks of prolonged and sordid negligence. The door, which was equipped with neither bell nor knocker, was blistered and distained. Tramps slouched into the recess, and struck matches on the panels. Children kept shop upon the steps. The schoolboy had tried his knife on the mouldings, and for close on a generation, no one had appeared to drive away these random visitors, or to repair their ravages. This video is going to answer the following question. How does Stevenson introduce the theme of duality in this extract? Let me first explain what this word duality means. Duality is related to the idea of someone or something having a dual nature. If a person has a dual nature, they have 2 sides to their personality. These 2 sides are opposites. I'll now give you some examples of different characters who have a dual nature. First of all, we have Bruce Banner. Bruce Banner has a dual nature. Whereas Bruce is a mild-mannered and intelligent scientist, his alter ego the Hulk is a violent and angry monster. Gollum from The Lord of the Rings also has a dual nature. As Smeagol, he is a gentle, kind-hearted creature, but as Gollum, he is a vicious and greedy monster. Sherlock Holmes also has a dual nature. Sometimes, Holmes can be alert and energetic, but at other times, Holmes is quiet and introspective. So let's move on to our first idea on this passage. Stevenson introduces the dual nature of London in this extract. That means that Stevenson demonstrates that there are 2 sides to this city. In this book, London has a respectable, pleasant side, and an unsavoury, dangerous side. Now we can see these 2 sides of London in our extract. Now, in this extract, the pleasant-looking street may represent the respectable side of London. This street drives a thriving trade, suggesting that it is a prosperous and bustling area full of shoppers. The street also has a gaiety of note, conveying its lively, joyful atmosphere. In addition, the street possesses a general cleanliness. demonstrating that this is a well-maintained and civilized area of the city. We could say that this street embodies the very things that made London famous in the 19th century. It is a centre of civilization and progress. Stevenson also introduces the corrupt, unsavoury aspects of London in this extract, as represented by the sinister-looking building. The introduction of this building marks a tonal shift in this extract. What is a tonal shift? Well, this is when the mood or atmosphere of a piece of writing suddenly changes. When Stevenson begins describing this building, the atmosphere suddenly becomes dark and threatening. In contrast to the respectable looking street, this building is dirty and discoloured. You know when mould might grow up a wall for a long time and then the wall changes to a weird yellow or brown colour? Well, this is how this building looks. It is dirty and decaying. Stevenson writes that on every feature it bears the marks of prolonged and sordid negligence. It is clear that no one has maintained this building. It has been neglected and allowed to rot and decay for years. Unsavoury characters such as tramps gather around the building steps. It's nearly like this building draws all the unpleasant, seedy characters of London towards it. Stevenson may be suggesting that this building somehow attracts all of the evil aspects of London towards it. Such descriptions of this building thus introduce the dark, threatening side of a capital. Stevenson is using this extract to introduce the different sides of the city. Whereas the pleasant-looking street seems to represent the respectable aspects of London, the sinister-looking building represents the corrupt, unsavoury aspects of the capital. Stevenson is maybe suggesting that this city is not as civilized as it seems. In a similar way that the pleasant-looking street hides the sinister-looking building, the respectable appearance of Victorian London perhaps hides the city's dark secrets. Stevenson is thus demonstrating right from the first chapter that appearances in this novel can be deceiving. London may appear to be a respectable and civilized place, but there is also a dark and corrupt side to the city. This sense that Stevenson is introducing an evil and menacing side of a city is further emphasized by his use of Gothic imagery in this extract. To understand the effects of such imagery, we must firstly introduce you to the Gothic genre. We're therefore going to learn a bit about the history of this genre before we move back to our extract. There are a few common tropes that define your typical Gothic narrative. They are characterized by an atmosphere of fear and suspense. They explore rather dark themes, in particular, the nature of evil. They also often involve different elements of the supernatural, such as demons, vampires, and ghosts. Now, the Gothic genre reached its height of popularity in the 18th century. This was long before Stevenson wrote Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was written at the end of the 19th century in 1886. In the 18th century, many Gothic novels were set in a medieval past, a past portrayed as an era of superstition and violence. 18th century Gothic narratives therefore typically centred around historical settings, such as old churches, castles, and monasteries. But a great change took place to the Gothic novel in the 19th century. Writers in the 19th century began to relocate the Gothic narrative away from its medieval roots, and instead set their stories in modern towns and cities. Stevenson was one of these writers. In Jekyll and Hyde, he has taken the frightening themes of the Gothic novel and relocated them to the modern city of Victorian London. This makes the novel all the more terrifying. It gives the impression that the powers of evil are a threat to the safety of respectable modern civilization. Let's go back to our extract now. We can see the influence of these Gothic tropes in Stevenson's description of a neglected, sinister building. Such imagery is similar to the descriptions of crumbling castles and churches common in the 18th century Gothic novel, but now describes a modern, urban building instead. Dr. Jekyll's laboratory. Stevenson is thus demonstrating that his narrative will bring the terrors typical of Gothic stories to the modern civilization of Victorian London. We've now finished looking at our first idea. Stevenson introduces the dual nature of London in this extract. Let's now go on to our second idea. Stevenson introduces the dual nature of Dr. Jekyll in this extract. This extract very much gives us a hint about the two sides of Jekyll's character. In this interpretation, the pleasant-looking street is symbolic of Jekyll's respectable reputation. You can tell a lot about a person by looking at the neighbourhood in which they live. As we can tell from this extract, Jekyll lives in a civilised, prosperous area of London. It is fitting that this wealthy and respectable gentleman lives in such a polite neighbourhood. This pleasant-looking street could therefore represent how Jekyll appears in public. He holds a reputation as a civilised and respectable gentleman, but, as we said before, in this novel, appearances can be deceiving. And this brings us to our next idea. Stevenson is also giving the reader a hint about Dr. Jekyll's alter ego in this extract. If a pleasant-looking street is a symbol of Jekyll's respectable reputation, then the sinister-looking building could represent Jekyll's evil nature, Mr. Hyde. It is fitting that this building should represent Mr. Hyde, because it is Jekyll's laboratory, the very place in which Hyde was first created. Stevenson cleverly describes the features of this building to thus reflect Hyde's villainous personality. The building is firstly described as thrust out upon the street. Now, this word thrust is a very violent verb. It creates the impression that the building has roughly pushed its way in front of the other buildings. Such a description could reflect Hyde's violent character. The building's outward appearance could also symbolise Hyde's inner morality. The descriptions of a laboratory's physical decay, with its discoloured and sordid walls, could symbolise Hyde's moral decay. The ugly appearance of a building is thus symbolic of Hyde's inner ugliness. And that brings us to the end of our second idea. Stevenson introduces the dual nature of Jekyll in this extract. Let's read through our two ideas one more time. Number one, Stevenson introduces the dual nature of London in this extract. And number two, Stevenson introduces the dual nature of Jekyll in this extract. Let's now go on to our lesson review. In this extract, Stevenson introduces the theme of duality in two main ways. First of all, he introduces the dual nature of London. The pleasant-looking street is symbolic of the respectable aspects of the capital, and the neglected, sinister building is symbolic of the unsavoury, corrupt aspects of the capital. London is a city with a dual nature. London has two sides. Stevenson also introduces us to the dual nature of Jekyll. The pleasant-looking street is symbolic of Jekyll's appearance as a respectable gentleman. And the neglected, sinister building is symbolic of Hyde's villainous nature. Both London and Jekyll have a dual nature, as introduced in this extract. This introduces us to a useful way of thinking about Stevenson's novel. The dual nature of Dr. Jekyll is symbolic of the dual nature of London. Jekyll's respectability is perhaps symbolic of the respectable aspects of London. Hyde's corrupt character is meanwhile symbolic of the corrupt aspects of London. Both London and Jekyll thus have a respectable side and an uncivilized, corrupt side. In this novel, setting thus reflects character, and character reflects setting. And that brings us to the end of this lesson. If you would like to learn more about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, click the links to my other videos on this novel above. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. I will be releasing more videos on Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde across the coming weeks and months. But for now, all the best.